The aroma of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the subtle sweetness of baked pastries filled the air inside a cozy cafe in downtown Chicago. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, the kind where the golden sunlight filtered through the windows, casting long shadows over the polished wooden floors. People sat at small round tables, their conversations blending with the gentle clinking of ceramic cups. It was a place where the city slowed down for a moment, where strangers shared a silent camaraderie over steaming lattes and half-read newspapers. Among the patrons sat Barron Trump, quietly sipping a cup of tea near the window. Dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans, he looked like any other young man, lost in the pages of a thick book. He had always preferred quiet places like this, spots where he could blend in, where the weight of his last name didn't precede him. Being the son of a former president had its challenges, and today he was simply seeking a moment of solitude away from the ever-present scrutiny of the public eye. But peace never seemed to last long. The cafe's atmosphere was abruptly shattered by a sharp, angry voice. "You think you're better than the rest of us?" The question cut through the air like a blade, freezing the room in place. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, silverware clattered against plates. A few people turned in their seats, eyes darting toward the source of the commotion. A man stood near the entrance, his posture stiff with anger. He looked to be in his late 40s, his face lined with exhaustion and frustration. His clothes, while not tattered, bore the signs of wear, like someone who had worked hard every day and had little to show for it. His expression was tense, his jaw clenched as he stared directly at Barron. Barron looked up from his book, his brows knitting together in quiet surprise. For a moment, he wasn't sure the man was talking to him, but the hard glare, the pointed finger, it was unmistakable. "You?" the man continued, his voice louder now, demanding attention. "Kids like you have it all handed to you. You ever had to struggle a day in your life?" A hushed murmur rippled through the cafe. Some patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. Behind the counter, the barista hesitated, her hand hovering near the phone, as if contemplating whether to call for help. Barron didn't respond right away. He closed his book carefully, setting it aside, his fingers resting lightly on the cover. He studied the man's face, the frustration in his eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly. Whether from anger or something deeper, Barron couldn't yet tell. "Sir," Barron said finally, his voice steady but quiet, "I don't know what's upset you, but maybe we could talk about it." The man let out a harsh, breathy chuckle, shaking his head. "Talk? What could you possibly have to say that someone like me would want to hear?" His words were laced with bitterness, his fists clenching at his sides. It was clear this wasn't just about Barron. This was about something much bigger, a lifetime of struggle, of feeling unseen, of watching others get ahead while he stayed stuck in the same cycle. Barron just happened to be the perfect target at the perfect moment. Most people in Barron's position might have reacted defensively, might have walked away, ignored the man, or even matched his hostility. But Barron did something no one expected. He leaned back slightly in his chair, his body language open, relaxed. And then, in the calmest voice, he gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Please, sit." The cafe went dead silent. The man blinked, caught off guard. His stance wavered for just a second, as if he hadn't expected this response. "Why would I want to sit with you?" he snapped. "You're just another spoiled kid who'll never understand what it's like to live in the real world." More whispers spread through the cafe. Some people exchanged looks, others reached for their phones, subtly recording the interaction. The barista had completely stopped making drinks, her eyes darting between Barron and the man, waiting to see how this would unfold. Barron didn't flinch. "Maybe you're right," he admitted, his voice measured, thoughtful. "Maybe I haven't lived through what you have. But if you sit down, maybe you can tell me what that's like." For the first time, the anger on the man's face wavered. It wasn't gone, but something shifted. He had come into this cafe ready for a fight, expecting entitlement, expecting dismissal. What he hadn't expected, what no one in that cafe had expected, was an invitation to be heard. The tension in the room felt like a stretched rubber band, seconds away from snapping. The man hesitated, his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he reached out, grabbed the back of the empty chair, and dragged it across the floor with a loud scrape. He dropped into the seat, crossing his arms over his chest, his jaw tight, his eyes locked on Barron. "Fine," he muttered. "You want to hear about the real world? I'll tell you." And just like that, the entire cafe leaned in, waiting for what would come next. The cafe was silent, save for the occasional hiss of the espresso machine and the faint clinking of cups being set down. Every eye in the room was discreetly trained on the man who had just taken a seat across from Barron Trump. His movements were tense, like he wasn't sure whether he had just made a mistake. Barron, on the other hand, remained calm. He sat with an easy posture, hands resting lightly on the table, his expression open but unreadable. He wasn't smiling, nor was he defensive. He was simply waiting, listening. The man exhaled sharply, running a hand through his graying hair before finally speaking. "You think you know what life is like for people like me?" His voice had lost some of its earlier bite, but there was still a sharp edge to it. "You ever had to wake up wondering if you can afford to keep the lights on? Ever had to decide between gas in the car or food on the table?" Barron didn't answer right away. He could tell the man wasn't looking for a response, at least not yet. This wasn't a conversation to win. This was a story that needed to be told. The man shook his head, his fingers tapping restlessly against the tabletop. "I had a job, a steady one. Worked at a factory here in Chicago for 15 years. Then one day, gone. Just like that. Company shut down, outsourced everything overseas. Hundreds of us left with nothing but a pat on the back and a good luck. A few patrons shifted in their seats, their expressions softening. This wasn't just some outburst anymore. This was personal. The man scoffed, his jaw tightening. "You know what the government did? Sent us job training brochures. Like that was supposed to fix everything." He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "I tried. Took every gig I could find. Construction, driving delivery trucks, even janitorial work. But nothing lasted. Nothing paid enough. And then..." His voice faltered. Barron didn't push. He let the man gather himself. The man's fists clenched. "And then my wife left. Took our 2 kids with her. Said she couldn't live like this anymore. Scraping by, barely making ends meet, never knowing what the next month would look like. I don't even blame her." His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. "I don't even blame her." A heavy silence settled over the cafe. The anger in the man's face was still there, but now it was different. It wasn't directed at Barron. It wasn't even directed at the world. It was the kind of frustration that comes from feeling utterly powerless. Barron leaned forward slightly, his voice quiet but firm. "That's a lot to carry." The man let out a hollow chuckle. "Yeah, kid, it is." For the first time, he looked at Barron, not as a target, but as someone who might actually be listening. He studied the young man across from him, his eyes narrowing slightly. "But what would you know about any of this?" he muttered. "You grew up in penthouses, private schools, security guards at your door." Barron nodded slowly. "That's true." The man blinked, caught off guard by the lack of defensiveness. "I've never worried about having a roof over my head," Barron admitted. "Never wondered if I'd have food on the table." He paused, then added, "And I know that means I don't understand your struggles the way you do." The man's jaw tensed. "Then why are you even listening?" Barron exhaled, choosing his words carefully. Because I think pain is pain. Struggle is struggle. It might not look the same, but feeling like the world is against you, feeling like no one sees you beyond the labels they've put on you, that's something I do understand. For the first time since the conversation had started, the man hesitated. His eyes searched Barron's face, looking for insincerity, for the usual empty words he was used to hearing from people who'd never lived a day in his shoes. But Barron's expression didn't waver. Everywhere I go, people assume they know me, Barron continued. They think they know who I am, what I believe, what kind of person I am, just because of my last name. He tilted his head slightly. Kind of like what happened when you walked in here. The man's brows furrowed. He opened his mouth as if to protest, but no words came out. You saw me sitting here and you assumed I was entitled, Barron said matter-of-factly. That I've never had a problem in my life. He let the words sit for a beat, before adding, and maybe that's fair, but maybe it's not. The cafe remained eerily still, every patron hanging onto the conversation unfolding before them. Even the barista had abandoned her station, leaning against the counter, eyes wide as she listened. The man rubbed a hand over his face, letting out a slow breath. Yeah, well, maybe I've been carrying this anger for too long. His voice was quieter now, less sharp. Maybe it's not about you at all. Barron gave a small nod. Maybe not, but if it helps to talk about it, I'm here. Another silence, but this time it wasn't tense. It wasn't charged with hostility. It was understanding. The man let out a tired chuckle, shaking his head. You're not what I expected, kid. Barron smirked. I get that a lot. For the first time since he stormed in, the man's shoulders loosened. His hands, which had been balled into fists, slowly relaxed. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. And across the cafe, something else happened. People started seeing the conversation differently. It wasn't just a rich kid and an angry stranger anymore. It was two people talking. Two people trying to understand each other, despite every difference between them. The cafe, once thick with tension, now held something entirely different. Something like hope. And no one, not even Barron, could predict what would happen next. The man sat back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his face, his fingers lingering at his temples, as if trying to ease a headache that had been there for years. His earlier rage had melted into something else entirely. Fatigue, maybe, or something even heavier. Barron watched him carefully, sensing the shift in energy. You really believe that? The man finally asked, his voice quieter now. That people just judge you before they know you? Barron nodded. Every day. The man let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. Hard to feel sorry for a kid who grew up in penthouses, you know. I'm not asking for sympathy, Barron replied evenly, just understanding. The cafe had settled into an almost unnatural stillness. Conversations had stopped. No one was pretending to check their phones or focus on their coffee anymore. They were all listening. You said earlier that people look at you and assume things, the man said, studying Barron closely. What exactly do they assume? Barron exhaled slowly. They assume I've had everything handed to me, that I don't have my own thoughts, that I don't have to work for anything, that I'm just some spoiled kid living off my family's name. He tilted his head slightly. Kind of like what you assumed when you walked in. The man flinched. He knew Barron wasn't saying it with malice, but it still stung. Look, Barron continued, his voice calm. I'm not saying my life has been hard the way yours has. I've never struggled the way you have. But that doesn't mean I don't know what it feels like to be judged before I even open my mouth. The man let that sit for a moment, drumming his fingers against the table. He still looked skeptical, but there was something else in his expression now. You ever been laid off with no backup plan? The man challenged. his voice quieter now but still carrying weight. Ever been told your years of hard work don't mean a damn thing to some suit in a boardroom? Barron shook his head. No, I haven't. Ever had to tell your kids you can't buy them Christmas presents because there's barely enough money for rent? Barron's jaw tightened. The man leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. Then how can you say you understand me? Barron held his gaze. Because I know what it feels like to be seen as something I'm not, and I know that no matter where we come from, no matter how different our struggles look, pain is pain. You don't have to lose your job to know what it's like to feel powerless. You don't have to be homeless to know what it's like to feel alone. The cafe was silent. The man exhaled, staring down at his hands. His fingers were rough, calloused, evidence of years of labor. He traced the cracks in his skin absent-mindedly, his expression unreadable. "You really believe that?" he murmured. "I do," Barron said simply. The man sat back, shaking his head, but there was no longer hostility in his movements, just disbelief. "You're different from what I expected, kid." Barron gave a small smile. "I hear that a lot." For the first time, the man let out a quiet chuckle. Short, bitter, but real. He looked down at the table, his anger slowly unraveling into something else. He rubbed a hand over his stubbled chin before finally sighing. "You know," he muttered, "I didn't wake up this morning planning to pick a fight with a kid in a coffee shop." Barron smirked. "Could have fooled me." That actually got a genuine laugh out of the man, soft, surprised, like he hadn't heard his own laughter in a long time. Barron leaned forward. "But seriously," he said, his tone steady, "why did you come in here so angry?" The man's smile faded. He swallowed hard. "I guess I was just looking for someone to blame," he admitted. "And you? Well, you were an easy target." Barron nodded slowly. "I get that." The man looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Do you?" Barron thought about it, about the cameras that followed him, the assumptions, the way people talked about him without ever knowing him. "Yeah," he said, "I do." A long pause. The man rubbed the back of his neck, glancing around the cafe as if noticing for the first time how many people had been watching. His shoulders tensed again, but this time, it wasn't anger. It was something closer to embarrassment. He cleared his throat. "Guess I should apologize," he muttered. "Didn't mean to make a scene." "You don't have to apologize for being angry," Barron said, "but you should give yourself a break. Carrying that much resentment? It's got to be exhausting." The man let out a short laugh. "You got no idea." "Maybe not," Barron admitted. "But I do know one thing. Judging people before you know them doesn't help." He offered a small smirk. "And, you know, it makes coffee shops really awkward." The man snorted, shaking his head. "You're a strange kid, you know that?" "I've been told," Barron replied. The cafe, once thick with tension, now felt lighter. Conversation started to pick up again, the barista finally turning back to the espresso machine. It was as if the entire room had exhaled all at once. The man let out another long breath, rubbing his face again. He looked tired, worn down, but no longer hostile. "You really believe people can change, huh?" he asked after a moment. "I think people want to be seen for who they really are," Barron said. "And yeah, I think that can change everything." The man studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, he extended his hand across the table. Barron hesitated for only a second before shaking it. The man's grip was strong, but not aggressive, just steady. "Name's Tom," he said gruffly. "Nice to meet you, Tom," Barron replied. And just like that, the conversation that had started with anger and accusations had turned into something completely different, something neither of them had expected. A moment of understanding. A truce. And the cafe, once divided, was now united by something rare and powerful. Empathy. And no one in that room would ever forget it. The handshake lingered for a moment, firm but unspoken in its meaning. It wasn't just a polite exchange. It was an acknowledgement. A bridge built between two strangers who, just moments ago, had been standing on opposite sides of an invisible divide. Tom, the man who had stormed into the cafe with anger in his voice and frustration in his eyes, finally released Barron's hand and sat back in his chair. He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck, the weight of something unspoken still sitting heavy on his shoulders. Barron could sense it. "You look like a man with a lot on his mind," he said, his voice calm. Tom scoffed. "Yeah, you could say that." For a moment he just stared at the table, his fingers tracing the rim of his untouched coffee cup. The earlier fire in his eyes had dimmed, replaced by something closer to exhaustion. "You ever feel like no matter how hard you try, the world just keeps knocking you down?" Tom finally asked. Barron tilted his head slightly. "I think a lot of people feel that way," he admitted. "But I also think what we do next is what really matters." Tom let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "That's a nice thought, kid. But when you've been beaten down enough times, it gets hard to keep getting back up." Barron nodded, considering his words carefully. "I don't think anyone gets through life without taking a few hits," he said. "Some just take them earlier than others." Tom looked at him, his brow furrowed. "And you? You taken any hits?" Barron didn't answer right away. He could have talked about the scrutiny, the assumptions, the way his name had made him a target long before he'd even had a chance to decide who he wanted to be. But he wasn't here to compare wounds. Instead, he simply said enough to know that pain doesn't care who you are. Tom studied him for a long moment, his jaw working as if he was chewing over something he wasn't sure he was ready to say. "I lost my son," he finally murmured. His voice was quiet, almost as if he wasn't sure he should say it aloud. Barron felt his stomach tighten. "I'm sorry," he said sincerely. Tom nodded absently. "He was my world, my reason to keep going. Then one day, he was just gone." The cafe, which had settled into a soft hum of background noise, seemed to fade again as the weight of Tom's words filled the space. Barron didn't rush to respond. Some things weren't meant to be fixed with words. Tom let out a shaky breath, gripping his coffee cup a little tighter. "You know, after he died, I kept waiting for things to make sense again. Kept thinking maybe if I just pushed through, if I just worked hard enough, I'd find some kind of purpose." He let out a hollow laugh. "Turns out, the world doesn't work like that." Barron remained quiet, letting Tom speak. "I lost my job a year after he died," Tom continued. "Spent the next few years bouncing between work, trying to make ends meet. But I wasn't really living, you know? I was just existing." The bear nodded, his expression understanding. "That's a heavy burden to carry." Tom scoffed. "Yeah, well, life doesn't exactly ask if you're ready for it." A pause. Then, for the first time, Tom met Barron's gaze fully. "I saw you sitting here," he admitted, "and I don't know, something about it just set me off. I guess I needed someone to blame." Barron leaned forward slightly. "And now?" Tom exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. "Now I just feel tired." Barron gave a small nod. "That's usually what happens when you've been carrying something too heavy for too long." Tom let out another breath, this one almost resembling a laugh. "You talk like someone a lot older than you." Barron shrugged. "I listen a lot." Tom smirked. "That much is obvious." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then finally, Tom pushed his chair back slightly and stood. He hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "Thanks for hearing me out," he said gruffly. Barron looked up at him and offered a small, genuine smile. "Anytime." Tom nodded, his mouth pressing into a firm line before he turned to leave, but just as he reached the door, he paused. He glanced over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. "You are not what I expected," he admitted. Barron smirked. "You either." Tom gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Then, without another word, he pushed the door open and walked out into the afternoon light. The cafe, which had been holding its breath, seemed to exhale all at once. Conversation slowly resumed, chairs scraped against the floor, and the rhythmic clinking of coffee cups returned. Barron sat there for a moment, staring at the empty chair across from him. Then, with a deep breath, he picked up his book, took a sip of his now cold coffee, and turned the page. But the cafe wasn't the same. People who had been strangers just minutes ago exchanged knowing glances. A woman at the counter paid for the next person's coffee. A man held the door open a little longer than usual. Small gestures, but ones that carried weight. Because for a brief moment, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, they had all been reminded of something important. That sometimes the loudest anger comes from the deepest wounds. And sometimes all it takes to change a moment, maybe even a life, is the simple act of listening. And just like that, a moment of anger turned into something unexpected, an honest conversation. A simple act of listening changed not only one man's perspective, but also everyone in that cafe. This story reminds us of something important. We all carry burdens, some visible, some hidden. It's easy to judge, to assume, to lash out when life feels unfair. But what if, instead of reacting with anger, we responded with understanding? What if, instead of fighting to be heard, we took a moment to listen? Empathy has the power to change perspectives, to shift conversations, and sometimes to heal wounds we never knew existed. We live in a world where division seems to grow stronger every day, but stories like this remind us that human connection is still possible. Now, while this is a fictional story created for entertainment, the lessons within it are real. How we choose to interact with others, especially those we don't understand, defines the kind of world we create. So, here's something to think about. The next time you see someone struggling, someone who seems angry, lost, or even just different from you, what would happen if you simply listened? That's the power of empathy. Thank you for watching and being part of this conversation. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss out on our latest content. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you find today's topic intriguing, comment 1 below. If it doesn't resonate with you, comment 0. Your feedback helps us create better videos that match your interests. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.